we're all gathered together, brought together in some way by an interest in brains and an interest in people and an interest in what difficult events do to brains. How difficult events impact us. And how difficult events impact children, and what we can do in relationship with children that's different from what we do now, that lets us move into a space of both wonder and relational connection with the children that we are in contact with. The first thing that's important to understand is exactly what it is that leaves behind the traces of difficult events in children's brains and in our brains. In order to give you a deep example of how profound the events surrounding a difficult period can be, I'd like to bring to your attention the research that has been done with Nepalese boy soldiers. These boy soldiers were being studied by a group of researchers who were wondering what the effects of war trauma would be on children. And what they discovered as they were doing their studies was that some of the children were doing very well, despite the fact that they were coming from the experience of being soldiers with all of the experiences of war, seeing their friends wounded, being wounded themselves, seeing their friends die, having to kill people. All of these experiences were experiences that were held in common by all of the boy soldiers. But some of them did not show the traumatic after effects of their experiences, and some of them were suffering very deeply. As the researchers looked at their data, what they discovered was that the boys who were not suffering so deeply were boys who belonged to villages where the villagers had received the boys back from their war experiences with welcome. The boys were reintegrated to their homes and their environments. In these villages, the boys who had PTSD, the numbers were very low. The boys, however, who were in the villages where they were not received with welcome, where they were excluded, where they were scorned, where they were not reintegrated into their homes, those boys had very high rates of PTSD. The only unifying number was boys who, this is sad, but it does have to do with children and trauma. The boys who had experienced torture had a very difficult time after the events. When we as humans deliberately harm another human, we leave behind, oh, this is very intense. What can I do? Do I have it in a bad place? Sure, absolutely. That sounds like a very good idea. Okay. Sorry about that. No worries. I'm very grateful not to make crackling sounds when I talk. Much better. Yay. I was trying not to move at all, which is not characteristic of my usual way of talking. Okay. I'll have a little drink. So, the kids who were hurt by other humans had very high rates of PTSD no matter what environment they came home to, which speaks to us about child abuse, because in child abuse, children are being harmed deliberately by other humans, and it speaks to us about the really intense effects of bullying. Peer verbal abuse, peer physical abuse, these events leave traces in children's brains. There are many different kinds of trauma that leave traces in children's brains. And peer verbal abuse and peer physical abuse and witnessing domestic violence and being in the presence of seeing people hurt leaves traces in children's brains that can be seen in MRIs. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, experiences of early medical procedures, car accidents, witnessing violence on television. There are so many events that can leave the traces of trauma in children's brains. And at the same time, the part of the brain that regulates stress is the part of the brain that is changed by the way that the child is received, no matter what the trauma was that the child has lived through, as evidenced by this PTSD research in Nepal. And just acknowledging that when there's been deliberate harm that a child has received from another human, then more help is needed, more care is needed, more resonance is needed, more attention is needed. And once we know this, we can begin to perceive when we want to bring in outside help for children that we are in relationship with and worried about. It's so important to understand and know that bullying is a trauma of childhood that many of us have lived through, but that has been consistently diminished in our culture. That old adage, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is not true. Words hurt us. Words hurt us, but words also heal us. And what we are here to talk about this evening is to acknowledge the trauma that children live through, but to begin to talk about the way in which we can use language to change the effects of trauma for children. The most important thing that I'd like you to leave with tonight is the strange idea that emotions are a gift. Many of us respond to emotions in other people with alarm. As a starting point, I'd like us all to consider what each of us would do if we had a 4-year-old, let's have a little 4-year-old girl, let's call her Gabriella, coming home from school and saying to us, I got really scared today. Notice what happens in your body. And I'd like everybody to think about what words you would say next in response to this little one. Just make a note of the words that you would naturally say. We'll talk about what you might naturally say in a little bit after we learn a bit about resonance and the brain. I wonder if there's somebody in the audience who doesn't mind being videoed, who would be willing to come up and be my demo buddy for this next thing that I want to do. Please come. I wonder if this moves easily. Hi, what's your name? Celeste. Celeste, come over here where the mic catches us a little bit. Okay, so this is Celeste. Everybody say hello, Celeste. I'm so grateful. Thank you for coming up. Let's say that Celeste is a baby. And let's say that we could see her brain a little bit. And we're going to see her brain by looking at the brain in the palm of the hand. It's okay if I touch you? Okay, I asked kind of late. Okay, so in this model, everybody do this with me. In the brain in the palm of your hand, your forearm is your spinal column. And then it comes up And this part of your brain, your hand, represents your brainstem. Your brainstem it has all the capabilities of a fish. So if we were thinking purely on a brainstem level, then we would be able to move, and we would be able to eat, and we would be able to mate, and we would be able to defend territory. That is the extent of a brainstem's sleeping and being thirsty. That's the extent of a brainstem's capacity. Now, this is where things get interesting, is where we look at the core of the brain above the brainstem. So we'll fold our thumbs over our palms in order to represent the middle part of the brain that's called the limbic system. And in particular, the amygdala, which is a Greek word for almond. They didn't know what things did when they were naming them. They would just name them what they looked like. So it looks like an almond, so they called it an almond, but in Greek, the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is the part of the brain that alerts when something is not clearly understood. So our bodies become alarmed when we don't know what's going on. People have often talked about the amygdala as being the fear center, but in actual fact, it alerts much more in response to not knowing. The brain of humans does not like to not know things. It really likes to know things. We'll talk more about that. Okay, and then if we fold the fingers down, fold your fingers down over your thumb and be gentle. When I first started this, I'm a little left hemisphere. I'm a little geeky. I'm not so good with the emotions. I've studied them, I've learned them, but I used to crank on my thumb. Be gentle with your thumb. Be gentle with your thumb, because what it's starting to represent is it's starting to represent the movement of the growth of neurons that happens when Celeste, the baby, has a mother. Now, when I say mother, it's actually not a gendered word for me, because research shows that if you have for example, if you have two male parents, the primary caregiver does the mother thing. Doesn't matter whether they are male or female or agendered. It's not important. What's important is the primary caregiver. And tonight I'll use the word mother for that, but please know it's anybody who's the primary caretaker of the baby. So the mother then has a baby. So Celeste's mother has a baby. And when Celeste is born, she's born for her amygdala to let her mother know that she doesn't know what's going on and that something's wrong, but she doesn't know what's wrong. So she's born to cry. Now, the brain does not actually move when we cry, but what happens when we cry is that this part of the brain goes dark. And this part of the brain is very active. So when a baby is crying, and they're hardwired to come out and let us know that they're not comfortable so that we can figure out how to take care of them. So when a baby is born, they're hardwired to cry, and when the mother takes care of them, then new wiring starts to appear in the brain. The brain is growing new tendrils that literally wrap from the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain, into and around the limbic system to hold it. Now, there's been a lot of beautiful research done. Is your arm getting tired? How are you doing?
I'm okay.
Okay. There's been a lot of beautiful research that's been done that shows how this begins to happen before mothers have any words at all with their babies, because a baby doesn't start to talk until a little later on. You know, they get their first words at about 18 months, and then, I mean, depending on the kid, and, you know, start doing full sentences at 2 or 3 or 4, but in those early months, they don't have words yet. So what happens is that the way that the baby knows that they make sense is from the mother's facial expressions. So if baby Celeste is scared, if somebody pops a balloon, then what happens is that the baby gets scared and maybe starts to cry. And the mother, who has been well supported in her own experience, looks at the baby, and for a split second, she doesn't even know this is happening, but for a split second, her face does the scared expression. Of course you're scared. That was a big noise. And then goes to soothing. Or the baby, the mom has been running, hasn't been able to respond to the baby's needs. The baby's getting more and more upset, and that's that little angry cry. And the mom's like, of course you're angry, and then goes to take care of her. Every time this happens, and with a baby, it's an infinite number of times that it happens. Every time this happens, neurons are being grown between the part of the brain that's the thinking and intentional part of the brain and the part of the brain that has emotional experience. So each time baby Celeste has an experience, she's receiving the message from her mother's facial expression and the tone of her mother's voice. You make sense. Of course you feel this way. You make sense. And every time the baby receives this, it starts to grow inside the baby's own mind, so that by the time the baby is 18 months old, she's carrying, I don't know if the mic will still pick me up, she's carrying the mother that knows she makes sense inside of her, in her own brain. She's carrying, her mother's now invisible, but her mother becomes installed as the person that lets the baby know that the messages that her body is sending her, her beloved feelings, have a reason, that they are feelings that make sense, that they are bringing messages that are important for the baby Celeste's well-being. Thank you, Celeste. And a small round of applause for Celeste for coming up and letting us video her. Thank you. I love that. I love the visual and tactile representation of what happens when we understand each other. So many of us in the audience may be sitting there thinking, okay, my mom had 6 children before I was born, and I know that my older sister raised me, and I'm pretty sure that my mother and I and facial expressions was not a thing. What about me? Here's the sweet news, and this is the news that I believe so supports our ongoing exploration, growth, discovery, and learning as adults in how to be with each other with language. And that news is that the neurons that we were showing growing for our Celeste are neurons that continue to be neuroplastic for our entire lives. We can be 90 years old on our deathbed, and somebody can say, of course you're terrified of death. You make sense. And that experience will grow new little neurons inside of our brain, and we will calm because we make sense. Even in the face of dementia, when people receive this kind of care, their brains grow these new neural connections that allow a deepening relaxation and a decreased stress response. Because for the rest of Celeste's life, of this little baby's life, her nervous system does not have to produce cortisol in order to get through the bumps of life. It's an entirely different way of being. When we outsource our stress to a sense that we are understood by others, then our bodies literally do not have to go into fight or flight to deal with stress. This is why warm maternal connection is the factor that completely changes life expectancy. People that are that have lower levels of income have lower life expectancy. There are many reasons for this. There are reasons of trauma. There are reasons of not getting adequate health care. There's reasons of not being taken seriously by the medical establishment. There are factors involving self-care and diet and nutrition. But all of these factors are equalized if we have warm maternal nurturing. So children, even if they are born in poverty, who have warm maternal care, have the same life expectancy as somebody who has much more money than them. It changes us fundamentally, cellularly, foundationally, to have experiences of being understood. And we are rarely understood. The language centers of the brain are located in the left hemisphere. Let me teach you a little bit about the left and the right hemispheres so that you begin to understand the implications of the language centers of the brain being located in the left hemisphere. Left hemisphere neurons do not reach very far. They make contact with their neighbors. They do not reach across the left hemisphere to make contact with a neuron that is on the far end of the hemisphere. So if David is a neuron in the left hemisphere, he can reach Kathy, and he might be able to reach Rob. But there's no way that he can get back here to the far corner. What's a name back? Who's in the back corner? So there's no way that David could reach Chris. There's no way that David could reach Chris if they were in the left hemisphere, if they were left hemisphere neurons. The left hemisphere is like a little marching army of getting things done. All of the little neurons in the left hemisphere work together to accomplish whatever the goal is that is in front of us. That focus on getting things done entirely precludes relational connection. As soon as we are in our little army of getting things done, then we're focused on details, we're marking off the items on our to-do list, and we're making sure that everything's happening at the right time. The left hemisphere loves punctuality. It prioritizes punctuality above relationship. And we see this both in the way that our society prioritizes getting to work on time, and in the way that we as parents are in relationship with our children, where we're saying, we get your shoes on. I don't care if you're imagining a very large white bat that is carrying you to another country. We do not have time for that right now. Get your shoes on and get in the car right. I'm going to count to 3. So this is our kind of the urgency that we often in our society are pressured into bringing into our parenting relationships. And we often have to go there. I mean, the society has this emphasis on us getting to work on time, and we need to drop our kids off before we can get to work on time. There's no time for giant white bats. And if we begin to understand the effect of left hemisphere language, of getting things done language on brains, we might begin to deliberately create a little more breathing room for the bats, a little more breathing room for imagination, a little more breathing room for presence. Because left hemisphere language and an urgency on time does not change brains. It does not foster the neural connections that reduce the production of cortisol in human bodies. Left hemisphere language and a focus on getting things done does not allow us to explore the infinity in the brains that we are in relationship with. And left hemisphere language and a focus on getting things done leaves our children vulnerable to the scarring that comes from unaccompanied trauma. In order to be with children in a way that diminishes a traumatic response, and I'd like to give you a sense of what the effects of trauma look like in children. Nightmares, memories that a child can't get rid of, being upset by memories, startle responses and jumpiness, depression, a harsh critical inner voice, feeling cut off from others, being constantly on guard, being irritated or having angry outbursts, having trouble concentrating. For those of you who have noticed that this list of symptoms may have something in common with ADHD, you will be very interested to know that there are a lot of researchers who are wondering that very thing. There's a beautiful book by Gabor Mate all about the connection between trauma and ADHD. That's a vital read. It's called Scattered by Gabor Mate. His last name is spelled M-A-T-E with a little accent aigu on it. And we can't know to what extent our little ones who are being diagnosed at very high rates with ADHD are actually suffering from trauma, in part because we, as the people who are in relationship with them, are being continually pushed and pulled by the gravity of our left hemisphere out of relational connection. The language centers of the brain are in the left hemisphere. There are only certain kinds of language that awaken the right hemisphere, that help to structure the right hemisphere. When we talk about feelings, we're entering the right hemisphere. When we talk about body sensations, we're entering the right hemisphere. When we talk about relational memory, I remember when you and I went to the park last Wednesday morning. I remember that you found a snail and that we looked at its shape together and that you said that you liked snails. Relational language changes a child's response to trauma. Talking about dreams and memories, about sensations, about experiences, about a shared sense of things. All of these things awaken children's right hemispheres and help to structure them the way we were looking at when we were able to work with Celeste. we were able to see this and feel this a little bit, the way the brain changes in response to relationship. There was somewhere I was going with that, so I'll stop and see if it comes back. We're changed by the kind of language that we use with each other. And we're changed by warm curiosity. When we have warm curiosity about what it's like to be somebody else than ourselves, then all of a sudden, something different starts to happen in brains. A lot of times, the openings that come to us from the children that we are in relationship with are the openings of them telling us about a feeling that they are having. So they will tell us, like I had you think about, what would you say to a little one who came home from school and said, "Hey, I was really scared today." When I thought about this sentence, I could feel the agitation and the protectiveness in me, the desire to stop whatever it was that had scared my child, the desire to let the child know that everything was going to be okay. I could feel this longing within me, almost like a gravitational pull, that I would say to this child, "Don't worry, honey, we'll take care of it. I'll talk to the teacher. We'll make sure that never happens again." Or that I would say, "It's not so bad, really. You know, people get scared all the time. We all get over it. It's just fine. It's going to be just fine." And a part of the reason that I could feel this gravitational pull in me is because it's a little terrifying to open the door to feelings. Feelings can panic us. And so one of the things we need is sort of a Russian nesting doll experience of being in relationship with children. So what we need to do is we need to start to notice the ways that we pull away from actually stepping into a much different and more interesting question, which is something like, "Oh, you were scared and that happened. I wonder if it was like being a little squirrel and having there be a giant cat," which is a very different exploration. We're starting to use metaphors. We're starting to wonder with each other. We're wondering, what's happening? What's it like? What's it like to be in this child's brain? What's it like to be in this child's body? What's it like to have an experience of being scared? It's such a different question than all of the ways that we try to panic, shut the door on the feelings and the longings and the aliveness that our children and even our friends and our relatives and our partners are bringing us. I know that when my husband says to me, "I'm so depressed," I just want to make it stop. I don't want to know what it's like. I just want to say, "Oh, honey, I'm sure it's going to be okay." I don't want to know what it's, the torture of living in the corporate world. It's not, it's so hard when we know that the people we love are hurting. I'm laughing, but I'm hoping that some of you are, here, give me a show of hands, because it's so vulnerable to talk about this. Who has some shared reality with me here? Okay, thank you for raising your hands. I really want to bring us to this sense of these Russian nesting dolls, that when we're turning toward somebody else who is having a beautiful, precious emotion, that we're holding ourselves and our reaction before we hold them. That I'm saying to myself, "Sarah, no wonder No wonder you don't want to know. Of course you don't want to know, because you get so worried and you have such a sense of helplessness, and you want to contribute to your partner's life and well-being. Of course you want to. Of course you want something different for him, and of course you don't want to know what it's like. To be able to fully resource myself. Do you hear how my of course is holding my own brain and letting it calm, so that it in turn can come to my husband and say, oh, is that what it's like for you? Of course it's difficult. Of course you long for something where there's meaning. Of course that's true for you. If we're just white-knuckling it, it's just more stress for our systems. It's just another way. I'm just giving you another way to beat yourselves up. Instead of giving you the idea of the Russian nesting dolls. Do you all know them? Those little, they're matryoshkas. The little tiniest doll is inside a little bit larger doll, is inside a little larger doll. And so as you open one up, you get to smaller and smaller dolls inside until you reach the very tiniest one. When I was a little girl, I loved the ones that had like 7, so that the tiniest one was tiny like a seed. We need to hold ourselves in this way where we get to say to ourselves, of course you're scared about your 4-year-old. Of course you don't want her to ever be scared. Of course you're longing for safety for all children, so that we can turn to the 4-year-old and say, is it like this? Is it like you're trying to imagine how to jump across a very large gap? Is it like you're there and you're all alone and there's nobody else there that you know? Is it lonely? Do you need friends? The practice of nonviolent communication is a practice that takes us also toward connection. And it especially takes us toward connection with children. I've offered you a way to move in to connection with children when they're having an emotional experience with the words, is it like this? I wonder if it's like this. But it's also possible to be in relationship with children with feelings and needs, which takes a little more practice, but is very interesting. My husband and I have spent some time working at NVC children's camps. And so I would be with him and we would be taking care of the kids. And I would hear him, and he was very good with feelings. He was at the camps with me, and he was very good. He was like, are you angry? Are you scared? And the children would be like, yes. And so if they were, are you sad? And the child would say, yes, and keep crying and crying. And so that night, I said to my husband, I wonder if you might be willing to try out the needs. Because in nonviolent communication, we practice with words that hold really big values and longings and desires. And when we bring those ideas into words, we're also activating the right hemisphere. When we name feelings, we're deactivating the amygdala by half. They can see this on MRIs. They can see that when somebody's talking about feelings, then their electrical activity in their amygdala falls by half. Now, I'm going to do a diversion before I go back to needs, because I have these favorite neuroscientists, and I haven't talked to you about any of my favorite neuroscientists yet. And one of my all-time favorites is Matthew Lieberman. And Matthew Lieberman was a researcher at UCLA, who was one of the earliest people to get an fMRI machine and to start to do relational neuroscience research, trying to figure out what people respond to, what makes them calm, and what makes them upset. And what he discovered was that when people name feelings, it makes them more calm. But then he thought, nobody names feelings. Why don't people name feelings? And then, so he did another research project where he asked people, do you think that if you name your feeling, you will start to feel better? And they all said no. So this is very interesting for those of us who teach nonviolent communication, because we always think we've found the most amazing technology that will change the world. And we wonder why nobody gets excited about it. Well, here we have straight research that lets us know that even though people get calmer when they name feelings, they don't think they're going to get calmer when they name feelings. And this is a little bit of our recoil from feelings. And I believe, this has not been shown by research, but here's what I think that the answer to this riddle is. And it goes back a little bit to the experience of hell in the right hemisphere. If we've never been held with resonance, with understanding, remember how we were doing this with Celeste. If we've never really had a sense of being held in the way that we were working with Celeste, then what happens is that the right hemisphere never grows those neurons, which is why the right hemisphere without those neurons is actually a fearful, fearful place. It's a place that can be, depending on the amount of trauma that we've experienced, fractured into horrifying self-criticism. The more self-critical our inner voice is, the more trauma we or our family system has experienced. So some of us are like, I've never experienced any trauma. Why is my inner voice so insanely self-deprecating? And the answer to this question can often be, what happened with trauma in the generation or generations before you? Because we actually make copies with our brains of the brains of the people that we were raised by. There's a direct transmission of the way that our parents used their brains to us. And for those of us in the room who are female, who are cisgendered female, here's the very interesting news about that. It goes back to Moshe Zhif again, and our mother being in every cell of our prefrontal cortex. Mother to daughter is the most direct transmission of neural patterning of any of the transmissions. It's more direct than father to son, or than father to daughter, or than mother to son. Mother to daughter, for some reason, is like, whew, there we are. So it's good to know that we get to give empathy to the mother's brains within us and to start a resonant language dialogue that begins to structure this right hemisphere so that it is not hell. But for many of us, it is hell. I know I'm going towards needs, but I'm going to tell you about another research project because I love it. Okay, and I find it very demonstrative of the experience. David, will you help me for a moment? Yes. What I'd like you to do, I will be the researcher and David will be the subject. And I'd like David to say no to everything that I ask him. Except when I ask him to give me his cell phone, he has to say yes. Okay, so David, thank you for being my research subject.
Yeah, no.
What I'd like to do is I would like to take this electric shock machine and I'd like to fasten a little bracelet around your ankle, and I'll give you $65 to shock you.
No.
Okay. Well, if you're saying no, then what I need to do is I have to fill out some paperwork, and unfortunately I have to take your cell phone with me. So would you please give me your cell phone?
No.
You have to say yes, remember?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so then I leave David alone in the room with the shock machine and nothing to do. They shock themselves because they get bored and curious, and because they have right hemispheres that are not fun to live with. And if they're doing something external, then they don't have to live with the internal difficult voices that stop them from being able to be in a good place at home inside their own brains. Thank you, David. Yes, a small round of applause for our research participant. Yeah. So here we are, a nation of people, 65% of us, of whom apparently, according to this study, have a tendency not to be very comfortable alone with our own brains. I can testify to this myself. It's 8. Oh my God. Okay. I can testify this to this myself because one of my habits, and sometimes I still do it, even though you will hear that it is a little embarrassing. I read at stoplights. Because if I read at the stoplight, my right hemisphere does not get a chance to speak to me. Even though I have written this gorgeous book that takes us through a step-by-step process that lets us come into more sweet relationship with ourselves, I think the traumatic memory, and I don't beat myself up in the same way anymore. It's kind of sweet to be alone with myself. Like when I'm falling asleep, I'm like, oh, I get to be alone with Sarah. And that's a completely different experience than any I've ever had. But I think I have a traumatic memory that comes up at stoplights that I used to torture myself. So I'm still like reaching for whatever I can do to look at in order to see how we're keeping our right hemispheres at bay. We're keeping those traumatized voices at bay. And those traumatized voices are voices that have come to us either through ourselves not being held during difficult events or through our parents not being held in difficult events and then transmitting their brain patterns to us. So the way that we respond to each other in the presence of deep feelings is hugely important. And the more that we know and practice having responses that are more like, oh, you're sad. Is it like being a leaf, the last leaf of fall that is coming down? The more that we move into responses that have poetry in them, that have resonance in them, that have metaphor in them, that have body sensations. Oh, when I hear you say that you're sad, my heart cramps. I wonder, does your heart cramp too? The more we're creating the of course message, of course you feel that way. That is how humans feel when they have difficult experiences. Of course you feel bewildered. Of course you feel sad. Of course you feel angry. Of course you feel frightened. Because that makes sense. Because feelings make sense. Whenever this happens, whenever we have the sense that we make sense, a circuit is being completed within us. When we have this felt sense that we actually make sense, then a loop is being closed for our body, and our body calms in the experience of having had an emotion. If we have emotions and people tell us that it's going to be okay, or if people tell us that it doesn't matter, or that we're too sensitive, or that we should just think about it differently, or have we tried doing this and such, or have we taken that to our therapist, then the loop doesn't get to be closed. So the more that we as groups learn about resonant language, the more we get to turn toward each other in ways that grow neurons, create sustainable change, allow people to be with stress in different ways, diminish the trauma response, prevent nightmares, prevent the disruptive memories that won't go away. The more that we create resilience against depression for a child's whole life, the more we inoculate children against the harsh, critical inner voice, the more we keep them having a sense that they belong, that they are not cut off from others, the more we reassure them so that their nervous systems do not have to be constantly on guard, the more we create an atmosphere of calm in which irritation and angry outbursts are held as expressions that make sense and are met with warmth and understanding. And the more ease our children will have focusing, the less they will have to be in a state of chronic activity in order to prevent the activation of their harsh, critical inner voice. We have a huge responsibility to one another as humans to begin to explore the right hemisphere and to begin to be relational with each other. Now that we know the importance of relationality for everyone's lifelong health and well-being, it is important to begin to turn toward it and embrace it. And in order to do that, we have to come back to those Russian nesting dolls. And we ourselves have to be held, and we have to hold ourselves as making sense. Thank you all. Now is time for questions and answers, and I wanted to make a third choice because David said you could be your voice could be deleted, but if you feel really shy, you're welcome to write your question down, and Susan, will you raise your hand? And see Susan's hand here, you can bring it to her. She's completely out of the view of the camera, and you can write a question and it can be brought up to me. But now we'll open for any questions that people have.
If you could just clarify that piece where you were saying the loop being closed. Is it the loop of the neurons connecting, or is it a loop of the process of
See,
healing,
here's a loop
or?
that was not closed. First of all, I'm going to finish the story about my husband, that I said, would you be willing to try using the needs words with the children? And so the next day he said, are you sad because you really want respect? And are you angry because you want teamwork and you want cooperation? And that night I said to him, Matt, how wonderful. You've been using your needs words. And he said, it's like cheating. The kids stop crying. So here's a very sweet reason to begin to learn nonviolent communication and practice with needs words. But Kathy, your question was about the loops. What do I mean by the loop being closed? Our bodies are constantly sending us messages. And they send us messages. There are these huge neural pathways that run between the body and the brain. And we would all like to believe that our neural pathways are running from our brain to our body, and that we have choice about what our body is doing in the world. But in actuality, 80 to 90% of the nerve fibers are running from the body to the brain, letting the brain know what our bodies are doing in the world and how they're doing and what they need. And so if we do not ever answer those longings with understanding, then those longings remain alive. The messages of our bodies stay alive until the loop of self-understanding is closed. So, is that helpful, Kathy? Okay. And then there was a hand up over here. Somebody had their hand up, but I don't see them now. Oh, there. Yes, you. Come on up.
So you talk mostly about children, but this applies to all of us, right?
It does. It applies to all of us. I was talking about children because we named that the title, and I was so proud of myself every time for remembering what the title of the talk was. Yes. Yes, David. Oh, and then after that, then Susan.
So lots of us work in schools in the crowd, and I'm wondering, in your research, have you found things that, structurally in terms of culture, like I'm really getting like this is an individual thing.
Yeah.
What have you seen in terms of school cultures or cultures of organizations that make this more possible, this type of resonance?
What a good question. In schools, there's a terror of trauma. I had the opportunity to attend a 4-week drug education class for kids who were in trouble in high school in my community, and there was no mention of trauma throughout the entire presentation. And maybe there are some of you in the audience that know that the link between adverse childhood experiences and early drug use is incredibly high. The more adverse childhood experiences a child has experienced, it goes from not very likely to, oh gosh, I'm so bad with numbers. Just like it goes to 11 times more likely that the child is going to use drugs. So if you have, it seems to me like like criminal negligence to teach families about drug use as if it had nothing to do with trauma. But I went up to the woman at the end and I said, aren't you going to mention ACEs? It's the last night. Aren't you going to talk about trauma? And she said, I'm not a counselor. I don't even want to open that door. So there's a terror. Do you see? This is another example of that terror we have about feelings. So the more I believe that the more we do the kind of education that I'm doing tonight, the more in schools we talk about the importance of resonance, the more we talk about the importance of acknowledgement, and we give people solid skills for resonance, like giving them little cue cards, like, is it like this for you? I wonder if it's like this. The more we can invite people to feel less panic themselves when they're in the presence of a child who's experiencing difficulty. And teachers are really on the front line between all of the violence and pain that happens for families with addiction and domestic violence and the child's brain. Teachers are so important and so need empathy themselves. I was just working in Maine, and there were people just in tears that they had to send children home to the homes that they knew that they were going back to. So how do we empower teachers to understand the enormity of their influence and how much their use of resonant language can calm and change a child's brain? So that's in the culture of a school. Brain education is so important. And then, yeah, was that the sort of the focus of your question? Yeah, thank you, David. We've got one here.
Sarah, the examples you used about the tremendous importance of us identifying feelings for children, the examples you used were unpleasurable feelings.
Yeah.
But would you address, I just want to lift up this
joy too. It's so important. If we're in our left hemisphere, we will actually diminish people's joy. So we'll tell people to be quiet. We'll do a reflection that's small. Like a kid will be like, "I'm so excited." And we'll go, "Oh, that's nice, honey." That's a diminishment of the child's joy. That doesn't create these neural connections that help a child to hold excitement and be able to be with it without stress. A child that has never been held in their excitement and never received this resonant reflection is a child whose body is literally thrown out of control by excitement. So it's just as important to be with a child, like, oh, is it like fireworks are going off in your chest? You know, how do we be with a child who is so excited in ways that let them kind of catch the enormity of their excitement and let it be something that's regulated and easy to be with? Because once we've been caught in that way, our excitement, instead of becoming agitated excitement, is a calm excitement. So it's just as important to be with children. Thank you, Susan, for this invitation. Just as important to be with children in their delight and excitement as it is to be with them if they're scared. Did I manage to answer in a way that, okay, wonderful. Hi.
Beyond the holding of emotions when we're being raised and parented, can you talk a bit more about how brain patterns are transmitted from parent to child, like all of them and not just the holding?
What a good question. I think it's a little bit like, as humans, we are actually made to create a group brain. So if we had all of you wired up to MRI machines while I was talking, in those moments where I was really holding your interest, then your brains are actually finishing my sentences before I finish them. So tonight, to whatever degree I have been an interesting speaker to you, I have invited your brains to be like my brain. And we are, so whoever we bring our focus to, we go along with in terms of what our brains do. Not just our brains, but our bodies, our heartbeats, our heart rate variability, our blood pressure. It all moves into sync when we're connected. So this is the primary way that children and adults sync up. And it's one of the reasons that neurodiversity can prevent a sense of successful parenting sometimes. If the child is not able to focus on the parent, then the child isn't able to, then the syncing doesn't get to happen the same way as when there's a smooth and easy connection between the parent and the child. Yeah, and stuff like colic can prevent a sense of easy connection too, or if a child has a really intense skin condition and they can't settle. All of those things that prevent children from settling and being able to relax into relational connection are things that it's good to acknowledge, because we're often kind of struggling with those things. And how do we create connection? It takes even more effort. And the more we know about resonance, the more we can capture these moments when a feeling is divulged, or when a liking is divulged. I like marmalade. That's that the child's expression is an opening for connection. Yeah. Was that helpful? Okay, good. Yes.
When you say that, of course you feel this way, or of course, that sounds like validating to me. And you said, and then the loop closes. It sounds like when a person is validated, then they become whole. That's what I related to what you were saying. Of course you feel this way. And then this loop closes. Yeah. And in my brain, that said, when I'm validated, then I can be whole. Yeah, yeah. Does that work for you? Does it? Yeah, I love it. Yeah. Great. Yes? Hi.
So do you have a prescription for those of us who have adult children who now have severe inner critics? Oh. And how can we help ameliorate that in their older age?
A number of things that I think are very interesting. One is to see whether they have a sense that we carry that voice, or if we ever carried that voice. So that's one question. It can give rise to very interesting conversations. Or do they think that the other parent carried that voice? That's one thing. There are a number of things. The next thing is to see if they have always carried that voice. Because one of the things that humans do, if they've had a traumatic experience in which they have not been accompanied, is that they split from themselves and they blame themselves for their pain. So it's almost like I'm a 4-year-old and my mom and dad got divorced, and it was really hard with lots of yelling. I like myself before I'm 4, but I don't like the child that I became after 4. If we find this kind of rupture in self-care, in self-love, then we know that there's a trauma that can be worked with. This happens all the time with children. I was most recently working with a child who had been severely bullied. This child did not like herself at all. And when we found out that she had been severely bullied, then we were able to forge a connection and an understanding of how much bullying is trauma that allowed her to relax and to begin to like herself and also not to see herself as angry. So these are very important. It's very important to realize that things that children might not perceive as traumatic, bullying, medical procedures, divorce, can be traumatic. So as parents, we're in a beautiful and unique position of if the child says, well, I like myself until I'm 7, but then I hate my 8-year-old self, then we know their life. We can go, oh, 7, that is when you went off to Minneapolis and, and I remember that there was a really difficult experience that happened there. So that's number 2. I think there's more. The next one is that people will create unconscious contracts out of love. So let's say a child has one parent who is severely depressed. The child may take on an agreement with themselves to hate themselves so that they do not leave the parent behind. They'll stay with the parent in their depression. And we're working with needs there. We're working with very deep needs that are being met with self-critical voices. And one of the ways to look at it is to say the sentence, I promise myself to believe that I am fat and ugly in order to, and then you leave that open. Like, what are you doing? What need are you meeting by promising yourself that you will believe this about yourself? I was recently working in Hawaii, and there was a woman who was 74, and she said, I can't get rid of this idea that I should never have been born. And when she did this sentence, I solemnly swear to myself that I will believe that I should never have been born in order to atone for the burden that my life was on my mother, no matter the cost to myself. And once that sentence was there, then she could begin to, something that had never been named was named, and a shift could begin. So there are a number of ways. Is this helpful?
Extremely. Thank
Okay,
you.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You talked about metaphor. I do metaphor a lot. Feelings, needs, and I get that feelings is part, but the needs is where people go, and they drop in.
Yeah.
I find that I use metaphor a lot, and that's something that I haven't seen a lot in NVC teachings that I've been around. I'm wondering if there's a reason or there's something about metaphor that makes things easier to get across, or some of our brains can accept it What are your thoughts on metaphors?
Well, it creates this sense of being understood. If somebody gets a metaphor and you're like, yeah, it is like that. Yeah, it is like being a small squirrel trying to cross a busy street. Yes, you do understand me. It closes the loop.
Right.
Yeah. With both impossible dream guesses and metaphor guesses where we say, is it like this, or do you wish that, some kind of, the needs energies are embedded in there.
Right.
And the need for acknowledgement and the need for understanding are hugely carried by metaphor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm kind of new to the NVC, but I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on how this is a really hard thing. I was having a conversation with someone about this just the other day with all the trauma that's being, our kids are being exposed to with these school shootings.
Yeah.
What can we do? How can we bring these principles to the young people who are living in this fear all the time?
Yeah.
I'd just like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. It's really sweet to be able to acknowledge the impact of the school shootings on the kids, on our kids, and on teachers, on people who work in schools, and all of us who love all of those people. Just to acknowledge the impact and how close it is for everybody. And it's really important. I was working with a school in Canada where there had been a school shooting scare, and I went in and got to work with all of the teachers. Didn't get to work with the students, but I got to work with the teachers. And one of the things that we did was we captured, like, the complexity of the feelings. Like, we made sure that we named all of the complex feelings. And we made sure that we named all of the complex longings and needs for acknowledgement that were in the room. That there was a need for acknowledgement of the level of terror, and the need for acknowledgement of the protectiveness for the children, the need for acknowledgement of the discomfort of not knowing, just many, many things. But this is the place exactly where that warm curiosity and the capacity to hold ourselves with care while we're turning towards our kids with warm, warm curiosity, is exactly there. So as long as a kid is speaking, we can bring, is it like this? And really listen. They might say, no, it's not like that, it's like this. The place where it gets really tough is when the kids are like, no, and then you've got nowhere to go, and you don't know if you're reaching out is a good thing, or if you've got a kid who won't talk, then it's like we're needing to make sure that we ask their consent. And that can be a really interesting process too, because I know that if I make a wondering, is it like this? And a kid says no, and they stop, then I think, oh, I've trespassed. I shouldn't talk anymore. But I was very surprised when my son told me, I have a 19-year-old son, so we've been working on this for a while, and when my son told me that, he said, why do you stop? Why do you become so silent? I tell you something hard and you just go silent. And then there's this long silence and then you change the subject. And I said, well, I made that wondering about what it was like for you, and you said no. So I thought you didn't want me to talk to you anymore. And he said, no. So then, in my nesting doll experience, I have to hold Sarah for the shock of the no and be able to keep going and to check in, for reassurance. Like, is it really okay if I'm asking you these questions? It's like we can say to our kids, we don't even realize we can say to our kids, I really want you to be accompanied here. I want to know how it was for you. If you don't want to talk about it, it's okay, but I want you to know that I want to know what it was like, what it's like for you to go to school, what it's like for you to be scared. I want to know. I'm not so scared. I'm not going to shut you down. And then, of course, we'll hear ourselves say something like, well, have you thought about it like this? And we go, oh, I did it. I did what Sarah does. I went into the left hemisphere and tried to manage. And then you get to say, I just slipped. I slipped out of wanting to know into trying to control it. So the kind of cool thing about them being our kids is that we have a long-term relationship with them, and so we get to stumble and try to find our way into relationality and into knowing and into understanding. Is this helpful at all? Okay, good. I always worry. Thank you.
I have a question that you may be able to answer. It's a little bit off, but I said, my question is, a baby shares connection with the mom while developing. And my question was, if that mom goes through trauma before a child is born, does that mean that the baby is already pre-exposed to trauma? And does that mean that their amygdala is already affected at birth?
Yeah. It's very interesting. My memory is failing me. There are certain moments in the pregnancy when the baby is more exposed to the mother's stress. So in the first trimester, the baby is exposed to the mother's stress. But as the placenta grows, it starts to create a buffer against the mom's cortisol. So stress that happens in the last trimester affects the baby less than the stress that happens earlier. But stress that happens for the mom changes the baby's stress response. It's like if the mom's body is stressed, then the baby's given a message that the world is dangerous. And so that baby has a more heightened response to stress. So for example, they've done huge scale studies with the moms who were pregnant during 9/11 and what happened with their babies, and they can look at the epigenetics and how there are epigenetic changes that make the kids more susceptible to stress. But the good thing to know is that what we're learning about tonight, the door that we're opening tonight, is a door that resolves those very changes. So no matter how much stress we've had, we can change things for our children with our warmth and our curiosity and our getting ourselves held so that we can hold them. Yeah. And for those of us who have grown-up children, we get to keep doing it too, and changing their brains for the rest of their lives as long as we're alive, and beyond, because we are in every cell of their prefrontal cortex. Yes, yes, we can be there with our love and our resonant empathy. We can change the juggernaut of generations. Yeah.
I think you kind of just answered my question. I'm the mother of a black son. I have a biracial family, and my youngest son is 3 years old, and he just has so much energy, but also, like, I've used the phrase, like, I feel like he's not tethered here to us. He's always trying to leave. And you know, I've had people say, oh, you know, ADHD in older kids, this is how it presents at age 3. And I guess my question, which I think you did just answer, would be, like, regardless if there was a trauma that I could identify, which I can't, or if it's something, you know, intergenerational, just trauma from the legacy of being African American and the history of what that oppression could have done to his little psyche. Yeah. it's the message, though, that's the same, right? Like, I don't need to worry about the root or the cause or the identifying or the untangling.
Yeah.
What I need to concentrate on is just the language of resonance and staying in my right brain.
Yeah. And getting resourced so that at least occasionally you can be slightly bigger energy than him. Just so that every once in a while you can go bigger than he is, because it's the experience of going bigger than their energy that lets them calm. So it's a new area of experimentation, and I imagine that you are cellularly exhausted.
Yeah.
And I also imagine,
Yes.
I'm imagining that you watch other mothers who are gently walking and their child is walking with them, and you think these people live on another planet.
Completely.
Yes.
Completely.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have tons of shared reality.
Thank you. That's so helpful. And just the idea of going bigger, because I feel like my job is always to go smaller.
No.
And go down and keep it down.
No.
And bring him back.
No, at least
I've never
sometimes.
Even thought
yes,
of
to go bigger.
Go bigger. Go bigger.
To run farther.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, thank
To
you.
run ahead of him.
Okay.
As he's running away. As all of the other mothers are sitting with their picnics and sitting quietly and their children are playing around them, you run faster than your child. And you think of me saying, yes, I understand completely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, well, it looks like we've come to a stopping point for questions. I'm so very grateful to be with you. I'm happy to sign books for people who would like me to do that, and just so grateful for your presence this evening. Thank you so much.